Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience. My name is James Paulock, and I'm the Executive Director of the McKellInstitute Victoria, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of our two digital events with Clare O'Neil on the future of work. Although this is a virtual event, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we all meet. We are here in Melbourne today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The future of work is front and centre for most Australians, and sadly, thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, an increasing number of Australians are finding themselves without work altogether. And many are falling through the cracks of the various economic support packages that have been put in place by government. Worryingly, many of those same people were already under strain with access to too few hours of work and too little job security. And as we will hear shortly, this is an experience that has been particularly felt by women. If there is a silver lining in today's webinar, it's that one of the sharpest minds in Federal Parliament is thinking about this challenge and on a mission to work with others to address it. Clare O'Neil is the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Technology and the Future of Work and member for the federal seat of Hotham. Clare brings to her role and this issue a rich experience working across local and federal government in multiple industries in the private sector and working directly on Indigenous issues. I would like to now welcome Clare to give her address.
I had with my mum when I was 4. She looked me right in the eye and said, "Clare, whatever you do in your life, you must always have your own money." It was something that she repeated to me throughout my childhood. Now, this is quite an odd thing to say to a small child, but I can still see her face. It was fierce, emotional and urgent. And down the track, I understood why. My mum grew up watching my grandmother have to plead with my grandfather for grocery money. She grew up in a family and a community where men used their financial power to control the women around them. That behaviour wasn't universal, but it was commonplace. My grandmother was a strong person, but she had a grade 4 education. The supporting mother's pension hadn't been brought in yet, and working wasn't really an option. No money, no choices, no freedom. My grandmother fought to get her own children educated. 3 of them were girls. She put up with it so her own children wouldn't have to. And my mother never wanted that to happen to me. Now, this speech today is not about me, not at all. I share that story with you because it illustrates that the issue of women and the future of work is not only about crucial questions of wages and security and entitlements. It is also about who has power in a society, who has control, who has choices, who has freedom. Today, I want to set out a few observations about how some groups of Australian women are going to be affected by the future of work, and how Labor, my party, which has been concerned with the economic power of Australians for 129 years, can do better by these women. Not so we can tell them how to live, but so those women have choices. First, a few caveats. I'm not only concerned with women and the future of work. This speech is one of a series on the major determinants of the future of work for all Australians, because the future of work will depend on who you are, on what you can do, on where you live. The first speech was delivered to the Chifley Research Centre last December, and I spoke there about how where you live in Australia affects your economic opportunities. Today I'm speaking about women and the future and work, and next month I'm going to talk about the changing nature of men's work and how this very significant change is creating huge challenges for individuals and families and communities right around the country. And later in the year, I'll talk about age and skills. So why gender? Gender is going to be a very significant driver of how Australians experience the future of work. That's because the Australian labour market is highly gender segregated. Carpentry is 99% male, childcare educators are 95% female. Truck drivers are 97% male, and 89% of registered nurses are female. Now, some will think that these notions of male and female work are some kind of hangover from a bygone era. That's actually not true. The way these numbers break down has been static now in Australia for about 20 years, and there's actually pretty good evidence that some of these trends are becoming more pronounced over time, not less. In some parts of the labour market, and especially in white-collar professions, gender segregation is not as much of an issue. There are lots of differences between men and women in most professions, but they're not as substantial as the ones that I've talked about. And today I'm not going to talk about women on boards and female CEOs and equal pay for female executives. Today I want to talk about roughly the 2/3 of Australian women who are working age in Australia who don't have a university degree. Gender segregation isn't just about the kind of work that women do. There are actually lots of ways that the different expectations we have on men and women play out in their working lives. And COVID has provided us with a really rare window into how those impacts interplay. Julie Collins, MP, who's Labor's Shadow Minister for Women, has been talking about these issues for months now. And so I just want to quickly talk about 6 of the ones that I think are most relevant for today. First, we know that women have been congregated in the sectors that have been most severely affected by the COVID shutdown. So particularly accommodation and food services and arts and recreation. Those 2 are the most affected sectors so far in our economy by the COVID shutdown, both sectors very dominated by women. Second, whether in those sectors of the economy or in others, we know that women are more likely to work part-time and more likely to work casually in Australia. So their connection into the labour market is not quite as robust as for men, and hence more women have been the first to have been let go by their firms. Third, women are much more likely to have been excluded from the JobKeeper program because there are more women in Australia who are casuals of less than 1 year. And fourth, we know that women are more likely to have worked in frontline roles. So 75% of Australians who work in health professions are women, as well as early educators, aged care workers, retail workers, and cleaners. Fifth, we know that women have shouldered more of the domestic burden during COVID. Preliminary statistics from a study being conducted at the University of Melbourne show that across Australian households, the work in the household rose. It rose for men and for women, but women bore the lion's share of that additional burden. So what that research shows is that during COVID, housework went up for roughly an hour a day for women and just under half an hour a day for men. And secondary caring activity like supervising, watching children went up 2 hours a day for women and a little bit less than an hour a day for men. The final impact I want to mention here is the impact of the superannuation drawdown policy. This will have a huge impact on men and women because it will exacerbate what is already a very large gap in the retirement savings of Australian men and women. HESTA has done some really important work that we'll hear about a bit later this afternoon from Mary, which shows that a high proportion of young women in particular have drained their superannuation accounts through the government's policy of early withdrawal. So the median account balance of HESTA's younger members is now just over $1,000. Dr. Andrew Charlton has done some really interesting research showing that if a 20-year-old today in Australia takes full advantage of this policy, so takes out $10,000 in this financial year and $10,000 in the next, they will forego $120,000 in their retirement. Now today, the average superannuation balance for an Australian woman is $160,000. So you can hear those numbers, $120,000 taken from this policy off an average of $160,000 that women retire on today. So I think there's pretty good evidence here that this policy is likely to have lifelong impacts for many Australian women and indeed men, materially affecting their quality of life in retirement. So I think the downturn as being described in the papers and around the place as the pink collar recession. I get that. I think that it's accurate and I hope that it's pretty well understood by most people who are thinking about how to respond to what's going on in the economy at the moment. What I want to contribute to the discussion today is to provide some new data which shows that even before COVID, even before all the issues that I've talked about, there were some groups of Australian women who were already going backwards. Today, I'm releasing data as part of an ongoing joint project with Dr. Daniel Molino, who's a respected economist and the MP for Fraser in Victoria, and the Australian Parliamentary Library and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So let's just quickly run over what we already knew. So when we look at the data, it tells us that women and men in Australia are roughly as likely to be as unemployed. There's an equal share of men and women who are unemployed. But what we also know is that women are much more likely to be underemployed. So underemployment is where you have some work, but you don't have the hours and you don't have the money you need to pay rent and food and bills and other essentials. So what we know about female underemployment is that about 8 to 12% of women who are in the workforce have been underemployed for about the last 20 years. But what's been missing is detailed localised data. So we know the headline numbers, but who are these women? Where do they live? And what are their characteristics? So when we come down from that national view I've described and look how the underemployment numbers break down between gender, age, region, and skill level, the numbers are no longer sobering, they are really scary. The pre-coronavirus data shows that there are significant differences in the employment opportunities between different groups of women. And there's one cohort that I want to talk about in particular today. These women are the unseen human face of Australia's underemployment crisis. They are young, they live in regional towns and the outer suburbs of our big cities, and they did not study much beyond high school. These women are likely to work in hospitality and sales as cleaners and laundry workers, and their largest area of employment is caring, in aid work and in community service work. So when we see governments kind of fly over the national unemployment numbers, they're actually too high up to see the dire situation that many of these women face. And these women have been effectively locked out of the growth that we have experienced in this country over the last decade. For many of these women, even before coronavirus, inadequate hours at work was an endemic, long-standing part of their working lives. So today, before COVID, the labour market wasn't meeting their needs, not even close. So I want people to remember that underemployment doesn't measure the people who are working in the labour force who are not working full-time. We're actually talking specifically here about a group of people who say that they need to work more to get by. And we're not talking about just $50 here for something that might feel discretionary. The Australian Bureau of Statistics data tells us that that underemployed Australians are seeking on average 15 hours of additional work a week. So we're talking about literally hundreds of dollars of shortfall for food and rent and bills. What really worries me about the numbers that we're releasing is how much the situation has deteriorated since the coalition was first elected 7 years ago. So over this period, underemployment of women in lower skilled jobs on the New South Wales Central Coast went from 22% in 2013 to 34% right before coronavirus. On the New South Wales North Coast, the number of underemployed women in this cohort jumped from 26% to 35%. Inland country New South Wales went from 19% up to 24%. Greater suburban Perth went from 17% to 25%. Western Victoria stepped up from 22 to 26%. The Northern Territory doubled from 7 to 14%. Southeast Queensland went from 21 to 24%. So the numbers I'm sharing with you there are underemployment, and underemployment is a particular focus for me, partly because these numbers are new today being reported to you, but also partly because this is the thing that's really changed for these women over the last decade or so. If we really want to understand their situation in the labour market, though, we need to add unemployment to those numbers. So that gives us the total share of women who either don't have a job at all or who are working a bit but not nearly enough. The combined numbers of under and unemployed Australian women in these particular cohorts is where the difficulties faced by these women in their working lives are really laid bare. Before coronavirus, the underutilisation of women, so either in or seeking low-skilled jobs in the Central Coast and North Coast of New South Wales, was more than 40%. 40% they need from the labour market. In Tasmania, it was above 35%. In Greater Perth and Southeast Queensland, almost 30%. So we're not talking here about a handful of women. The share of women of working age who didn't study much beyond high school or have a certificate 2 or 3 is 2.8 million Australian women. So that's the broader cohort here. Of these women before coronavirus, 600,000 were either unemployed or underemployed. So in other words, 600,000 women who are being ignored by a government that loves to pat itself on the back and say that it came into this crisis from a position of strength. And now we know that this exact same group of women are going to suffer greatly, much more than the average Australian, in a recession that could take years to play out. So if there's one message that you take away from this speech today, it's this. Inadequate hours at work and the financial pressure it brings is not a new problem for these women. It wasn't created by COVID, and it will not disappear when we resolve the COVID situation. Hundreds of thousands of women have been suffering for many years in many parts of the country. And if you're doing that national flyby of the data, you don't see them. They've been excluded from the national discussion and completely ignored by Scott Morrison's government, treated as though they're invisible. The woman at the epicentre of this neglect is a 23-year-old woman living on the New South Wales Central Coast. She didn't study beyond high school. In all likelihood, she might work in food preparation or cleaning. She'd be casually employed and chronically unable to find the hours of work she needs to get by. So despite 30 years of economic growth, which has come to an end at this recession, this woman has been left behind. Now, I said up front that work is about more than money, it's about choices. And these women are being denied the right to choose a more secure future. The problems they face go well beyond where they go to work every day. Problems with lifelong consequences that are not just financial. When you're in this kind of financial distress, buying a home is just not going to be possible for you. Retraining is just too expensive and too risky. You don't know how much income is coming through the door next week. How can you juggle that kind of uncertainty with family and care responsibilities? Relationship breakdown, horrible at the best of times, can turn into a fast track into poverty. And getting back into work after a period at home looking after kids can be really, really hard. Some of the women I speak to who are trying to make this transition say that it can take them years to just feel that they've got any sense of a foothold back in the workforce. And of course, we know that older women who try to make this transition later in life face all the challenges I've mentioned, as well as the fight against age discrimination. And we know where these problems lead. Poverty in retirement, Australian women being the fastest growing group in homelessness, and a new generation of young women who face few opportunities and few real choices. Now, these women are not powerless. They're underemployed and they vote. But in the discussions I have with them, my sense is that many, though definitely not all, feel really disengaged from politics. Some of the women I talk to are really angry at Canberra, but many aren't. They just don't see why they should care about a place that doesn't care about them. And when I talk to these women, they all say the same thing. No one is listening. For them, Canberra feels like another country, maybe even another planet. They see a bunch of men in suits who are doing a lot of yelling and not a lot of thinking. And if they needed another example of their secondary place in the policy conversation, then Canberra's policy response to COVID is a really good place to start. It is abundantly clear that women have suffered more economically in this crisis. And yet the first industry in line for fiscal stimulus was the construction industry, where the workforce is 88% male. Now, I'm really supportive of that, and it's great to see that support there for construction workers. But why only there? Especially given that we saw two other announcements from the Morrison government at roughly the same time. First, that childcare educators, who weeks beforehand were being lauded as the great frontline workers showing up every day in the middle of a pandemic, were the first people in the entire economy to be kicked off JobKeeper. And that workforce is in vast majority female. And second, the announcement that the government's first policy to snap back, as they call it, to its pre-COVID state was to remove free childcare. Now, childcare is the biggest driver of the decision of Australian women with children to work or not to work. And in a massive recession, this is the first support to be taken away. The attitude seems to be, let's get the men back to work first, and then we'll worry about the women. And that tells us everything we need to know about how this government thinks about work, how they value work, and how they see it. The role of women here is pretty clear. Second income earner, second priority, and second class citizen. Now that decision, and those decisions that I've talked about, were made by an expenditure review committee of 5 men, and they clearly have no idea what they are on about. I wonder if any of them have had to scramble around frantically trying to text friends and family, looking for someone to sit with their kids while they watch cartoons so these women can go and work a shift that they just can't say no to. And I know none of them have had to dash to a childcare centre, madly breastfeed, and then pass the child back to a carer without even time for a cuddle. My sense is that the people who made this decision have had someone else taking care of these responsibilities and decisions, the juggle, for their whole working lives. Now, this is not the case for all men, not even close. But in the world of these men, I reckon it's always someone else who's done the flex, makes the compromise, and scrambles around when the unexpected occurs. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made these decisions. They would know that these decisions will smash the wallets of Australian families, and they have the potential to hold Australian women back for years. We know that a lot of women have become unemployed since COVID hit. But did you know that since February, 320,000 women have left the labour force altogether, just in the last few months? So they're not working, they're not even looking for work anymore. So that's more women not earning an income, more women bumped off the promotion track. And I really fear that with the policies as they stand, that we're going to look back on this moment and see this as a turning point for many Australian women in their participation in work altogether. So what opportunities do we have to make a difference to the lives of the women I've talked about, to really give them more options and choices? The next election is quite a while away, so I'm not making policy announcements today. And indeed, the problems that I'm talking about here are not ones that Labor can solve from opposition. But I do want to finish by talking about one of the big opportunities that's available to us here. In the future of work conversation, one of the prevailing public narratives is that our children are going to do jobs that we imagine. And I know in some instances that will be true. After all, 20 years ago, no one would have thought that Instagram influencer was a viable profession. But the hand-wringing about the unknown is a little bit overstated. We actually know quite a bit about what the jobs of the future are. For many Australians, the future of work will be in care. Already, the health and social service sector is huge, employing more than 1 million people, and most of them are female. This sector was the fastest growing driver of jobs over the last 5 years. We look ahead, we see a growing, ageing population, we see a rising standard in the quality of care that the public expects for Australians with additional needs. And according to the Commonwealth's own employment projections, the healthcare and social assistance sector will create 250,000 jobs over the next 5 years. And that's twice as many jobs as other major sectors in the economy. There is so much to celebrate about this change. Not only are lots of jobs being created, but those jobs are being created across a range of skill levels suitable for a lot of different Australians. And one of the big challenges in Australia's modern economy is that economic opportunity isn't always being generated where people live. We're seeing lots of concentration of growth in the middle of our major cities, but not so with care work, where generally the spread of jobs will follow the population. So the growth in the caring economy, an area where women are already so dominant, is a big opportunity here. If we can make those jobs quality jobs, then we can make a substantial difference to the lives of millions of Australians now and in the future. The problem is that today, many care workers in Australia are underpaid and undervalued. Evidence given at the Aged Care Royal Commission is really telling, where a predominantly female aged care workforce is asking why, when they are doing some of the most important work in the community, they're being paid in the range of somewhere between $21 and $23 an hour. I see the same with early learning educators. The work of these educators is absolutely critical. And there's pretty good evidence that the quality of care that children receive in that 18 months before they start school may have more influence on their life outcomes than the quality of education they receive in their years of primary school. And yet the mainly female workforce in this profession is paid half the average Australian wage. Now, if these were problems of the past and slowly resolving over time, I wouldn't be concerned. I wouldn't be as concerned. But what really worries me is that where we're seeing new and emerging models of care, new problems are being created for this workforce. The NDIS is a Labor reform that I'm incredibly proud of. It takes the dignity and choice of care and it gives it to the person with disability to choose the kind of support that's going to most improve their quality of life. It's a great and worthy motivation for social policy. The implications for the workforce, though, are really worrying. What those early years of the NDIS show us is that many people with disability want short, frequent bursts of care at either end of the day. So for the worker, that can mean piecing together shifts across multiple employers. It can mean large amounts of downtime between work, and just generally a pretty ragged experience of what it is to work in this industry. The largest major study into the working experience of NDIS workers was published by UNSW earlier this year, and it makes for genuinely shocking reading. I'd really love for you guys to have a look at it. It shows us that NDIS workers are often poorly paid. They're taking on huge amounts of risk. They undertake extensive unpaid work. They are often in highly insecure employment arrangements, including a small but pretty fast-growing number of disability care workers who are employed through digital platforms that operate a bit like Uber. So their labour is virtually being auctioned. So the result is that there are a very fast-growing number of women and men for whom life working in disability is actually really intensely difficult. And the day's often described to me a bit like this. You might work with a client for 1 hour, commonly spend about a quarter of that time working in that household but being unpaid. They might then sit in their car in a shopping centre car park waiting for the next job, which could be a couple of hours away, and then arrive home after being gone for half a day with less than $50 in their pockets. So that kind of working life is not what was intended by coming out of the NDIS. I know that Labor would have implemented that policy very differently, and I know in fact Labor was very alive to these concerns when the idea of the NDIS was being germinated. But it's an important case study for us because consumer-driven care, where the client is in control of the resources that are being spent on them, is a big trend in the delivery of social services, and it has a lot of positive elements. But we need to create public policy that empowers individuals to make choices about their care and also create steady, reliable, dignified work for carers. And we're not there yet. The big picture point here is this. In each instance, whether in disability or aged care or early years, the social value of the work being undertaken by that worker clearly exceeds the value we place on it economically. There's a saying in aged care, you might earn more washing a car than washing a grandmother. Now that may be a slight exaggeration, but the point is well made. If that's the case, something is really off in our labour market. So how do we change this dynamic? Well, I've spoken to a lot of experts and lifelong campaigners for improved conditions in care over the past few months. And there are a lot of people in my party and in the broader labour movement who have spent their entire lives thinking about this problem. Most point to these really deep perceptions we have about women's work in caring as somehow being seen as an extension of the caring work that they do in their personal lives for free, and hence it's not really valued. Some highlight the same gendered view that's driven the invisibility of women in the COVID response, that in public policy, in public perception, women's work is still considered secondary or even somehow discretionary. So we need to affirm, obviously, that women's work is real work and that women work today not for pin money, as one academic put it to me, but because they need wages to live independent lives as they have a right to do in a modern Australian society. We need to set a vision for what caring work should look like and the value it generates. And ultimately, we need to get into a virtuous cycle of better training, improved care, improved productivity, better wages. We need to think about how we're going to create clearer on-ramps for some of the women that I've talked about today, who deserve better choices about the work that they do and better access to jobs that they can count on. If we invest more in getting these women access to skills, we pay them more and we get more for it. And that's the cycle in which we all win. There's a lot of talk at the moment about how our economy could look different after COVID. But I want really everyone to note the enthusiasm with which politicians of all stripes have adopted the concepts of revitalising manufacturing and other heavy industries. Canberra is virtually feverish with the prospect of using government policy and presumably government money to revive these male-dominated industries. Now, these are really good conversations. They're really important and I support the direction. But the real no-brainer coming out of with absolute certainty permanently improve the working lives of millions of Australians is for us to work in a bipartisan way to align the social value of the caring work done in the economy with the economic rewards that are given to this predominantly female workforce. And the winners in that are everywhere. We have better health and wellbeing for Australians, a smaller gender pay gap. we get better opportunities in the regions, reduced poverty for working women now and in retirement, and jobs of the future that millions of Australian men and women can count on. Now, I get that these things are complex and expensive. This is not a solution for every underemployed Australians. And again, they're not problems Labor can fix from opposition. But there's a huge upside to be grabbed here. And what else is government for but to secure the things I've talked about for Australians? I started out today talking about my mother, and I want to finish talking about my mother-in-law. She lives in Northern Victoria. She is a dyed-in-the-wool National Party supporter, and she would be appalled to be in the speech of a Labor parliamentarian. She's made an exception today just for me. She is the backbone of her country town. Kids and grandkids through the local country school. She's everywhere that you need her to be, and she makes the best PAV role in the district. And she's an aged care nurse. She's in her 60s, the main income earner since the family sold their dairy farm. She does the most important work in her community. She gives the elderly people, many of whom she's known her entire life, a happy last 6 months. And she's there at the very end. Every day, I reckon she creates more social value than any of us. She gives people comfort, she helps them with their most intimate tasks, and she shows them respect at the most vulnerable moment of their entire lives. When I called her today to ask if she'd be willing to be in my speech, all she wanted to talk to me about was her patients and how we can do better by them. And these workers are worth their weight in gold. But all the talk about the crucial role of frontline workers over the last 6 months doesn't mean much if we can't do better by them. We need to do better by the women I've talked about today in caring roles and beyond. There is a big group of women out there at the moment who are being ignored by Scott Morrison's government, women who are being treated as though they're invisible. And if we want to do better by them, we have to see them, we have to hear them. The difficulties they face in their lives are intensely real and have long-term consequences. Australia's standard of living has grown significantly in the last couple of generations, but the choices these women face has not grown at the same pace. Now, we should not knowingly go into a future of work where some Australians get better opportunities than ever and others go backwards, but that is what is happening. The situation is not inevitable. There's a lot we can do to give these women more choices. And I think in a country like Australia, that's what they deserve. So James, that brings my formal comments to a conclusion. And I think now we're going to move into a panel discussion with 2 other experts.
That's right. Thank you, Claire, for sharing those insights with us today. And a glimpse of the data you've been working on with your colleague, Dan Molino. To unpack some of the detail in Claire's speech, we are now joined by Mary Delahunty. Mary wears many hats, including serving as a counsellor in Glen Ira and head of impact at HESTA. HESTA is Australia's super fund dedicated to serving employees in the health and community sectors. In many ways, the people on the front line in the fight against COVID-19, and of course, in many cases, women facing the employment challenges outlined by Claire today. At HESTA, Mary leads their work on responsible investment. This includes today's news about the fund's goal to support net zero emissions by 2050, and work on closing the gender super gap and investing in affordable housing for women. To facilitate today's conversation is Ryan Batchelor. Ryan was Director of Policy to Prime Minister Julia Gillard and Chief of Staff to Jenny Macklin as Minister for Family and Community Services, Housing and Indigenous Affairs. More recently, he was Executive Director at the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet. Across these roles, Ryan has worked on developing Australia's first national paid parental leave scheme, household stimulus in response to the global financial crisis, and on the response to the Royal Commission into family violence here in Victoria. There's capacity for those of you watching to send through questions. We obviously won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best to feed them through to our panelists and keep the discussion flowing. But your questions and comments are also helpful for us in shaping our future events, including the next instalment with Claire herself. So please get engaged in today, and now I'll hand over to Ryan.
I think it's a really timely speech and really important contribution to the debate. So thanks very much for that. Mary, great for you to be here too. We know that HESTA plays a really important role in protecting and trying to service the future of a lot of women as they go through their working life. An industry super fund that looks after the caring industries. One of the things I'm interested from your perspective arising out of that work is what the impact of the kind of work environment that Claire's talked about, both the undervaluing, the economic undervaluing of caring work that are predominantly done by women, but also the insecurity of a lot of that work has on prospects for retirement, economic security in retirement, and also any of the things that you're noticing as a result of the crisis, and what effect that's having on those prospects.
Sure, thank you, Ryan. Claire, that was an incredible contribution. And I think, you know, when you hear that, everyone at HESTA, we catch our breath a little bit at the end, especially about not just the PAV role, but the dignity that's afforded by people who work in, our members basically, who work in those caring professions for people either at the end of their life or on the worst day of their life or sometimes on the best day of their life. And the fact that they can actually be the face of poverty in retirement is what motivates us to keep talking about this. I think when you've got we've got about 860,000 members at HESTA, predominantly women, predominantly drawn from the health and community services sector, and predominantly voiceless, as Claire said, that our obligation becomes to be their advocacy partner, because money talks sometimes, and we're about $53 billion of funds under management. So we can act in a number of different ways to try and draw attention to their working life. And really what you're hearing about that underemployment, underutilisation, increased casualisation in their workplaces, that's all magnified in retirement, because we've got a system that's predicated on the time you spend in the workforce and the amount of money you earn when you're in there. So that's naturally going to have worse outcomes for those of us who take time out of the workforce or who are underpaid relative to our male colleagues when we enter it anyway. And what we're seeing now with early access was a scheme designed to help people at a really vulnerable point, which we support. But what we've seen now is that a number of our members have drawn, incredibly significant amounts out of their super because they need it, because that was their working life to begin with. And so they were constrained by their ability to be able to have full participation anyway. They've drawn on their money at a time that is right for them, but they're young, and because of the nature of their work, we're worried they'll never get it back again. And how would they really, when all of the policy settings don't help them in order to get that back? So we've had about 91,000 members draw money out of superannuation through early access. That reflective of our membership base, around 80% of them are women. They're younger. 60% of them, just over, have applied for the maximum amount to be drawn out. And we're leaving us with balances in the younger cohorts of around $1,600, in the older around $3,000, and we've had just tranche one of this. So we don't at all suggest that there wasn't need there to begin with. The need was there to begin with because of all the things you just outlined. So something's amiss in a country as generous and benevolent and profitable as ours, that doesn't reach into those particular sectors and say we can do better by you. And what you'll see in retirement is increasing homelessness. And I don't think any of us really can face a country where a nurse who has given so much to her community is homeless in retirement as a result of a system setting. Nothing she's done, nothing about the choices she's made, everything about the system that she had to participate in.
I think one of the things that's really disturbing when you reflect on where this problem really starts is that a lot of these workers, and in particular women, are essentially living in poverty, even though they're working, and that should not happen in Australia as a starting point. But they're ultimately paid by government, so it's us that's choosing to treat them that way. And something I just have found really staggering, actually, in the policy discussion post-COVID is that we had the government in Canberra, saying all the right things about our frontline workers, and, you see it all over the world, people clapping for carers. Well, it means nothing if we don't then have a real conversation about how these people are treated by taxpayers, by governments. And I just think, it all rings a bit hollow otherwise. So, good time to have the conversation.
It's an incredible tipping point, especially if you look at the free childcare debate, which, I don't think any of us are very keen to see stop, certainly not in July, and the clock is ticking on that. I think, and HESTA's taken an advocacy position on this. We would really like to see some deep research done on what that actually is doing to the workforce and how that can better help productivity in the future. but we're clawing towards that snapback. Really reluctantly. I think we can see within our membership what that has delivered to people. It's a double dividend, as you were saying. There's a childcare and early education element to it. There's a workforce participation element to it. And whilst it's in there and being catered for, we would really like to see it continue until some
closely when we see that wash out, if the government does remove that support in July, as they have said, is how many women choose to leave the labour force in the months beyond that. Because, you know, every family has been affected by COVID, but we know that there's going to be a lot of people looking at that employment market, thinking about how on earth they're going to manage childcare fees when they were already having those underemployment problems, and now they're going to be so much worse. I just think, you know, this could be a real turning point for Australian women in how they participate in work, and a real entrenchment of that notion of women as the second income earner in the family. And then actually, you know, for some Australian families that works fine, and I don't have any judgment about that. If that's how people want to live, I've got no issue with it. The problem is relationship breakdown and other things like that, which see the women bear a lot of the risk of having come out of work, and they go into an employment position that can't really be recovered from when you've been out of work for a decade. You know, you can't just jump back in where you were before.
And I think, you know, a couple of years ago when we were here in Victoria responding to the Royal Commission into Family Violence, that the links between economic security for women, the gendered nature of work, and the societal impacts of those issues interplaying, which, you know, we recognised, the Royal Commission recognised, and steps were taken. I worry that there's the consequences of the economic challenge that we're facing out of this pandemic is going to mean those issues are going to writ large again, and we're going to face them. Claire, one of the things that I think really struck me in your speech was the comments that the future of work in many respects will depend on where you live, and the regional impacts of some of these trends. Wouldn't mind hearing a little more from you about what we know about these, what particular areas we're talking about, what are the jobs that we're seeing women predominantly are in, and what you think we can do to try and address some of these issues.
It's a really difficult problem, Ryan, because the way that developed economies like Australia, the way that economic development is occurring is creating lots of inequalities that didn't really exist before. And really that's like having been given this future of work portfolio, that's my focus. What are these big changes and how are they affecting different groups of Australians? One of the biggest drivers of economic opportunity in Australia today is where you live. So one of the issues with moving to a knowledge economy or a more digital economy, which is sort of happening not as fast as people think, but it is happening, is that more and more jobs, and in particular the best opportunities, are being created in our major cities. And actually, interestingly, it's not just the whole city, it's the middle of the CBD. So there's a stat from the Committee for Sydney, which says that over the last decade, half of all jobs that were created in Australia were created within 2 kilometres of the General Post Office in Sydney and Melbourne.
Wow.
Now, we are a very big country, and people everywhere around the country have got to benefit from the growth that's being created. And we are not seeing the sorts of things we need to see to make sure that happens. So as with a lot of these things, changing the structure of economic growth is really difficult, and it requires government to really think about and engage in how growth is happening. One of the very damaging kind of permanent features of recent public policy debate in Australia is this idea that government has no role in touching growth in the economy, that it should sort of just step back and let the economy do its thing. The reason I find that concept so frustrating is because it's just completely untrue. Government is intensely involved in the economy, and it's shaping growth in ways that aren't being very thoughtful and strategic. So government spending in Australia is more than 1/3 of our GDP, and the government's building roads and creating infrastructure and funding universities and funding places in education, supporting different industries, but without any sense of strategy. So I think the biggest thing that we could do is actually a philosophical shift about what do we think the role of government in the economy is in Australia. And if we accept that it's significant, which it undeniably is, then how can we bring a more strategic approach to that? And if we really set about as a country saying that we want to see a more even spread of growth across the country, then we can do that through investments, through thinking about how we connect universities into new creations, into jobs growth. There's lots of ways that it can be done. It just requires a sense of political leadership I'm trying not to be too partisan, because I think that's not a Labor Party event, but it requires basically a sense of real strong leadership from government. And, I get endlessly frustrated in Canberra because the Nationals get into Parliament, some of them representing the poorest communities in the country, and say all the right things about regional development. It never goes anywhere, So, yeah, we need to do a lot better in that respect.
Absolutely agree. Mary, you work in impact and investing in HESTA. One of the things, obviously, that I absolutely agree with Claire, that government has to play a more active role in dealing with some of these challenges. From your perspective, with $50-odd billion of funds under management, what do you see the role of the superannuation industry, people like yourselves, thinking through some of these challenges and thinking through the impact of your investment in tackling many of the issues that Claire's talked about today?
I think it's really, it's quite exciting to be in industry super land when governments seem willing, and indeed they are at the moment, certainly at the state level, to have conversations with us about innovative partnerships for investment. And we want to see, we want to see this country recover and recover quickly. We want to see a green-led recovery, but we want to make sure that there are decent work elements attached to that, and that they're going and spread wide regionally and across genders. Now, we've got deep investment experience, and I speak across the entire superannuation sector, and deep experience in investing in infrastructure. We would love the opportunity to be more active participants in that conversation with every level of government to see how we can better build this country, and do it in a way that is thoughtful, and have the government participate in a way that doesn't really, regardless of ideology, it doesn't really brush up against either of them, as in it's still a free market, we're still private partners, but there are innovative ways that we could talk right now in order to kickstart the economy again, that Industry Super, HESTA and many of our colleagues stand really ready to do. Now, state governments have been very willing to have that conversation. We are in conversation at a federal level as well, and I'm really hoping we can see something come of this, where unlisted assets and infrastructure investments are able to be participated in without a political undertone of feeling like I'm worried about the partisanship here, so I'm just going to talk to you.
Yeah, that's all right.
Without that sort of politics getting involved, which I think we can all do without right now.
Seeing the social dividend from the economic dividend that we also are seeking to achieve. One of the questions that we've had from the chat is questions about, and you referred to this a little bit in your speech, the consequences of having certain industries and certain sectors of our economy that are female dominated for such a long period of time, other industries male dominated, they appear to be silos. Are there any things you can talk through a little bit about how we might break some of that down, get more solutions that cross that divide? Yeah,
absolutely. I thought, I've obviously been thinking a lot about this recently, and I think it's really important for us to conduct politics in the real world, and the real world is what I've talked about. However, I don't love some aspects of it, and I'm sure, Mary, I speak for both of us, it would be a lot better for everyone if we had more men in aged care and more men in childcare, and we had more women in construction and infrastructure. That's a really worthy social goal that has a lot of different benefits to it. One of the things that we know is that if we improve the status and the wages in caring professions, more men will come into those professions. That's the best evidence we have from around the world, that the more we professionalise, build skills, pay better, get better services, the virtuous cycle, then we will actually see the gender dynamics of some of these industries resolve themselves. So that's another benefit that I talked about. But I think targeting public policy there isn't where I would start. I just think we need to accept the reality of this. And these are deeply entrenched ideas about the role of men and women in society. They're not going to change in one term of a Labor government. So my focus is, how are we going to help these women right now? This is where a lot of them are working. And so that's really my focus. But for sure, changing this would be good. And we can do that if we fix some of these jobs.
One of the things that you've mentioned, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, but it's something close to my heart, so I wanted to touch on it, which is, I spent a lot of time in government working on the development of the NDIS. It was, a great Labor achievement, but then we lost government at a particular time, and the development and implementation have occurred by the coalition, which there's been many great success, but there's also been some shortcomings. One of the things that strikes me is reflecting back on the time we spent in thinking about how the NDIS should work. There was obviously some thought given to some of the workforce issues. We knew that it was going to be a predominantly female workforce based on the history that we had. It was interesting, I was reflecting at the same time, as we were developing the NDIS, we were also pushing through pay equity cases and supporting, so it wasn't a single push that we were making. And I think that occurs, where that occurs, that's really important. What do you see from a policy development perspective, and maybe also from an investment perspective, how we can correct the system going in, the design of policy, the design of investing going in to try and address some of these challenges that we know are going to come in the future? How do we get the policy, the design right of some of these programs?
Look, I think it's a really important question, and Ryan, I'm really interested in hearing a bit more from you too about what the nature of those conversations was, because I know that it was being thought about a lot. And I mean, one of the difficulties with the NDIS is we created the policy and then someone else got to implement it with a different set of values. So that's politics, isn't it? I mean, like just to be a bit simplistic about it, I think one of the really important things here is having a stated goal of, what problems are you trying to fix here? One of them ought to be that we want to see decent jobs coming out of the policy reform that we're undertaking. And I'm not sure at the time, and love to hear from you about this, about whether that was really understood, that we were going to be creating this workforce of thousands and thousands and thousands of people working in disability, and just to what extent people thought about what kind of jobs are going to look like at the other end. There's lots of ways that this can be resolved, but it is going to be a long-term problem and it's going to be expensive. But Brian, tell me what your experience was. I mean, you were right there in the room.
Yeah, to be honest, I think one of the biggest challenges we were focused on was a supply question. We knew that there was great underservicing and a lot of need for services to be delivered. Our biggest challenge, I think, on a workforce front, and certainly where a lot of the initial emphasis went, was on, well, how do we get the people into these?
Where are we going to
find their staff? And we also did know that it was something that was going to be delivered all across Australia. Your point that service and care jobs follow the population. They're not jobs that are just solo created within 2 kilometres of the CBD. So we had that in mind. I think where we needed to do more work was thinking through what the concepts of choice and control meant for the institutional and delivery mechanisms that are put in to support it. So how were the people going that protected the rights and security of the workforce, but did it in a way that delivered the right amount of flexibility for the people with disability and their carers and their families who needed it. And to me, that second part is something that we knew we had to deal with. We didn't get enough time to do it before we lost government, and something I think that has been totally neglected in the years since. I don't know, Mary, if you've got any thoughts about the industries.
I know that conceptually, consumer-directed care is the right way to go. It puts more power into the people's hands who are receiving the care, and we support that. But we had concerns, as I know many of our union partners did, in the lead up to the development of the NDIS as to what the workforce would take and what the unintended consequences are when you have a number of different employers, for example. And one of the things that we talk about quite a lot, and Claire knows this like the back of her hand better, is a tiny little twitch of the eye in the superannuation system called the $450 threshold. And what happens is, everyone knows this, what happens is that when you have multiple employers, you run the risk of falling under that threshold all the time. And it's just one of those little annoying kind of stone in your shoe things that overly impacts women and overly impacts women without an advocacy voice again. And so, we'll probably never get to it under this particular regime, but we may get to it over time if we keep talking about it enough. But it's one of those things we were concerned about going into the NDIS structure. And increasingly, as we see consumer-directed care, that's increasingly what happens. So I think that some of the pursuits are still really worthy, and some of the implementation has been very good. But to scratch under the surface and have a look underneath a little bit and see what can be done in those kind of areas is still a worthwhile cause.
I think that point about industry is really important here, that we often think about this employment, the service and employment relationship as being at a very firm-based or individualised level. Clearly the solution to some of this problem is thinking about an industry-wide set of standards or industry-wide understanding of employment, so that individual employers may not matter if someone is falling under that threshold, that we're able to lift them up and give them that security. And I think also that this is not something that's going away. Aged Care Royal Commission, major growth in the family violence and children's services workforces. Across the board, this is not just about disability. We're going to confront it in aged care. We're going to confront it in other care settings. I think it's a really important part of the debate.
Just before we move away from that, Ryan, I really want people to understand this new phenomenon of care workers getting their work through online platforms, because this is going to grow and be a bigger part of our world as Australians. These, and I mean that I'd say women, they're predominantly women, they are piecing together their employment situation through like an online auction, almost like a dating app somewhere between a dating app and Uber. But these women are getting paid so poorly, and when you meet them and speak to them, they're so worried about their clients. That's all they want to talk to you about. And I just feel like we are just betraying those women, you know, and they shouldn't have to be employed through that. How are they going to train themselves to get better, you know, a better job and better pay if they're in this situation where they're just getting, you know, piecing together an hour here or there? They're doing some of the most important work. It doesn't make sense.
It speaks to the broader issue of valuing care work in this country, which we haven't really done. We're still expecting women to do it unpaid, even though we know that adds to the economy. Either they do it unpaid in their professional capacity, or they do it unpaid in their personal capacity. But either way, it's not been valued properly.
And I think that's really what our challenge is understanding that security. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this discussion. I'm going to keep having it with you immediately after here, and I think we should more broadly have that a longer conversation about these issues. And it's really great that McKellInstitute here in Victoria is sponsoring this and also part of that public policy conversation. So Claire, thank you very much for both the speech and the discussion.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Mary, thank you very much, and for HESTA support. And James, thank you very much for organising this on behalf of McKellInstitute here in Victoria, and thanks to everyone who's been joining us.
Thanks.
And see you next time.